The morning everything changed, started with the sound of my nephew Marcus dropping a ceramic coffee mug on my kitchen floor. The crash echoed through the house like a gunshot, and I watched from my wheelchair as he stood there, frozen, staring down at the shattered pieces scattered across the tiles I had personally selected. Just 2 years before my accident. "Aunt Claire, I'm so sorry," he stammered, his face flushed red with embarrassment. "I'll clean it up right away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I maneuvered my chair closer to survey the damage. It was the mug with the faded photo of my late husband David and me from our honeymoon in Tuscany, the one I had been drinking from every morning for the past 15 years. The image was now split down the middle, David's smile separated from mine by a jagged crack that seemed to mirror everything else that had broken in my life over the past 8 months. "Don't worry about it," I said, forcing a smile despite the knot forming in my stomach. "Accidents happen." But as I watched Marcus hastily sweep up the pieces, something felt different about this particular accident. He had been staying in my guest room for 3 weeks now, ever since he claimed he needed time to figure things out after losing his job at the marketing firm. My sister Patricia had called me in tears, begging me to let him stay until he got back on his feet. She played the guilt card perfectly, reminding me how Marcus had always been such a sweet boy, how he had visited me in the hospital every day after my car accident, how family needed to stick together during difficult times. What I hadn't expected was how quickly my house would transform from a sanctuary into what felt like a boarding house. First it was just Marcus, sleeping on the pull-out couch, and promising to help with household tasks. Then Patricia started dropping by daily, always with some excuse about checking on my recovery, or bringing groceries I never asked for. Soon my brother-in-law, Robert, was joining them for dinner 3 nights a week, and my younger sister Angela began hosting her book club meetings in my living room because, as she put it, Claire has so much space now that she's not working, and it keeps her company. The truth was, I didn't need company. What I needed was peace. What I needed was the space to grieve, not just David's death 2 years ago, but also the life I had lost 8 months ago, when a drunk driver ran a red light and left me paralyzed from the waist down. What I needed was time to figure out how to rebuild my identity as something other than the successful architectural consultant who used to climb construction sites in steel-toed boots and design custom homes for wealthy clients across the Pacific Northwest. Instead, I found myself surrounded by well-meaning family members who seemed to think my accident had also damaged my ability to make basic decisions. They spoke to me in the same gentle, patronizing tone they might use with a confused elderly relative, always asking if I was managing okay, or if I needed help with tasks I had been handling perfectly well from my wheelchair. But that morning, as Marcus finished cleaning up the broken mug, something shifted. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact, or the fact that he had been unusually clumsy lately, knocking over things and breaking small household items with increasing frequency. Or maybe it was the phone call I had accidentally overheard the night before, when I rolled past the guest room and caught fragments of a conversation that made my blood run cold. "She's not going anywhere," Marcus had whispered into his phone. "The doctor said the paralysis is permanent. She can't exactly run off and start over like she used to." I had stopped outside his door, my heart pounding as I strained to hear more. "Look, Patricia, I know it sounds harsh, but we have to be realistic. Aunt Claire is going to need long-term care eventually. She's only 52, but living alone in this big house, it's not sustainable, and that inheritance from Uncle David, plus her settlement money from the accident, that's generational wealth we're talking about. If we don't position ourselves as her primary support system now, who knows where that money will end up." The words hit me like a second collision. I had retreated to my bedroom that night, mind racing, trying to process what I had heard. Was my family really orchestrating some elaborate scheme to gain control of my finances, or was I becoming paranoid, reading sinister motives into genuine concern? The answer came 3 days later, when Patricia arrived at my door, carrying a folder thick with official-looking documents, and wearing the kind of forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Claire, sweetie, I've been thinking," she began, settling herself at my kitchen table without being invited. "Marcus mentioned you've been struggling with some of the paperwork stuff lately. You know, managing bills, keeping track of appointments, that sort of thing. I felt my jaw tighten. I haven't been struggling with anything. My cognitive function wasn't affected by the accident. Patricia, I can still read, write, and manage my own affairs. She held up her hands in a gesture of surrender. Of course, I didn't mean to imply otherwise. It's just that Robert and I have been talking, and we think it might be helpful if we could assist you with some of the more complex financial decisions. You know, just to take some of the pressure off. She slid the folder across the table toward me. We had a lawyer friend of ours draw up some documents, nothing major, just a power of attorney arrangement that would allow us to help with banking, insurance claims, that sort of thing. And maybe we should also look at updating your will, considering how much your circumstances have changed. I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. The documents weren't simple power of attorney forms, they were comprehensive legal instruments that would give Patricia and Robert broad authority over my financial affairs, medical decisions, and property management. Buried in the legal language was a clause that would allow them to make decisions about my living arrangements if they deemed me unable to maintain independent residence safely. But it was the proposed will that truly took my breath away. The document outlined a distribution of my assets that bore no resemblance to my actual wishes. The house that David and I had designed together, the one where we had planned to grow old, would go to Patricia and Rob. My investment portfolio, built carefully over 20 years of successful architectural work, would be divided among my siblings. The settlement money from my accident, compensation for a lifetime of mobility limitations, would fund college educations for their children, and for me, a small trust fund that would cover basic living expenses and medical care, while I resided in an appropriate assisted living facility. I looked up at Patricia, who was watching my face with barely concealed anticipation. This will, I said slowly, assumes I'm going to live in a nursing home. Well, not necessarily a nursing home, Patricia said quickly, but Claire, be realistic. This house has stairs, high cabinets, a bathtub you can't use. It's not designed for someone in your situation. And living alone? What if you fall? What if there's an emergency? I haven't fallen once since I came home from the hospital. I've adapted the house perfectly well for my needs. But for how long? Robert's voice came from behind me. I turned to see him standing in my kitchen doorway, Marcus beside him. When had they arrived? How long had they been listening? Robert walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder with the kind of patronizing gentleness that made my skin crawl. Claire, we love you, we want what's best for you, but you have to understand that your needs are going to change. Your condition might deteriorate. You might develop complications. We're just trying to plan ahead to make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of, I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Is that what this is? Taking care of me? Of course it is. Angela's voice joined the chorus. She had appeared in the kitchen as well, carrying a casserole dish, and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested this conversation had been planned in advance. Claire, you're being stubborn. We're your family. We're the ones who'll be here for you no matter what. I looked around at the three of them, plus Marcus hovering in the background, and realized I was surrounded. They had orchestrated this moment carefully, choosing a time when I was alone, when I couldn't easily leave or escape the conversation. They had come armed with legal documents and emotional manipulation, presenting their financial takeover as an act of love. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Patricia agreed quickly, but don't take too long. The lawyer said, there are some tax advantages if we get these documents filed before the end of the quarter. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the documents spread across the table. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows. David and I had positioned to catch the western light, illuminating the papers that would effectively erase my independence and reduce me to a financial asset to be managed by people who saw my disability as an opportunity. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the conversation I had overheard, the way they had spoken about me as if I were already dead, my life reduced to a collection of financial instruments to be redistributed among the surviving relative. I thought about the gradual way they had inserted themselves into my daily routine, always with reasonable explanations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Always with my best interests at heart, but mostly, I thought about Dave. He had died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years ago, leaving me not just financially secure but wealthy by most standards. His life insurance policy, combined with my own successful consulting business, had given us the kind of financial freedom that most couples only dream about. We had planned to travel, to build a second home in the mountains, to spend our later years pursuing passions instead of paychecks. The accident had changed those plans, but it hadn't changed my financial situation. If anything, the settlement from the insurance company of the drunk driver had added another layer of security. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, to modify my house as needed, to hire help if and when I required it. I didn't need my family's management or protection. What I needed was to understand exactly what they were planning, and why they thought a woman with full cognitive function and significant financial resources would simply hand over control of her life, because she now used a wheelchair instead of her legs. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting them directly or signing their documents, I decided to investigate. I wanted to know how long they had been planning this, what conversations had taken place behind my back, and exactly how far they were willing to go to get control of my assets. I started with Marcus. Over the past 3 weeks I had noticed that he spent a lot of time on his laptop, often late into the night. He claimed to be job hunting, but I had never seen him actually submit applications or go to interview. When he left the house that afternoon to run errands, I maneuvered my chair into the guest room and opened his computer. What I found made my hands shake with rage. His browser history revealed dozens of searches about disability law, estate planning, and something called financial abuse of vulnerable adults. But more damning were the email threads he had been having with Patricia and Rob. The earliest email in the chain was dated just 2 weeks after my accident, while I was still in the hospital learning how to transfer from my bed to a wheelchair. The subject line read, "Claire's situation. We need to talk." I scrolled through months of correspondence, watching in horrified fascination as my family dissected my life like vultures circling carrion. They had discussed my psychological state, my financial assets, my daily capabilities, and my long-term prognosis with the cold calculation of business partners planning a hostile takeover. Patricia had researched the average life expectancy of paraplegics, apparently disappointed to discover that with proper medical care, I could expect to live for decades. Robert had obtained copies of my medical records through connections at the hospital where he worked as an administrator, sharing details about my injuries and recovery progress that should have been confidential. But it was Angela's contribution that truly stunned me. She had been documenting what she called incidents of cognitive decline and emotional instability, creating a file of my supposed symptoms that could be used to support a claim of diminished capacity. Every time I had been tired, frustrated, or simply quiet during family gatherings, she had noted it as evidence of mental deterioration. The most recent email, sent just the day before Patricia had arrived with her legal documents, contained a detailed timeline for what they called the transition. Within 6 months they planned to have me declared incompetent to manage my own affairs. Within a year I would be moved to an assisted living facility. My house would be sold, with the proceeds managed by a trust controlled by Patricia and Rob. They had even researched specific facilities, focusing on ones that accepted long-term residents with significant assets. The monthly costs were astronomical, which would drain my resources more quickly and justify their control over my finances. But the final email in the chain was the one that made me close the laptop and sit in stunned silence for nearly an hour. It was from Marcus to Patricia, sent the previous evening after they had left my house with the unsigned documents. "She's suspicious," he had written. "I think she might have overheard something. We need to move faster. Maybe we should consider the medical route instead of waiting for her to sign voluntarily." The medical route. I didn't need to guess what that meant. If I wouldn't agree to give up control of my life willingly, They were prepared to have me declared mentally incompetent by medical professionals who had never examined me. I closed the laptop and rolled back to my kitchen, my mind racing. Everything I had suspected was true, and worse. My family hadn't just seen my accident as an opportunity for financial gain, they had seen it as a solution to what they apparently considered the problem of my independence. For 8 months I had been grieving the loss of my mobility, struggling to adapt to a new way of moving through the world, learning to redefine my capabilities and limitations. I had been focused on healing, on rebuilding, on figuring out how to construct a meaningful life within the parameters of my changed circumstances. While I was doing that essential work of survival and adaptation, my family had been planning my destruction. That afternoon, I made a phone call that would begin my counterattack. I contacted my lawyer, James Morrison, who had handled my legal affairs since David's death. James had known us both for years, had drafted our wills, had helped me navigate the complex legal processes following David's death and my accident. "James," I said when he answered, "I need to see you as soon as possible, and I need to ask you something. Is there any legal way for my family to have me declared incompetent to manage my own affairs?" There was a long pause. "Claire, has someone suggested that you're not capable of managing your affairs?" "More than suggest, they've drawn up documents giving themselves power of attorney, and drafted a new will that essentially disinherits me in favor of placing me in long-term care." Jesus Christ. James's professional composure slipped. "Are you safe right now? Do you need me to come to you?" "I'm safe for the moment, but James, I need to know my options. I need to know how to protect myself legally, and I need to know how to make sure this never happens to anyone else." "Come in tomorrow morning. First appointment. And Claire, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything, and don't let them isolate you. If you feel unsafe at any point, call me immediately." That evening my family gathered for what had become their regular dinner at my house. Angela had brought her famous lasagna, Patricia had picked up wine, and Robert and Marcus were setting the table as if this were a normal family gathering instead of a group of predators circling their prey. I watched them with new eyes, seeing the performance for what it was. Every solicitous question about my comfort, every offer to help with simple tasks, every concerned comment about my well-being, was part of an elaborate theater designed to establish their narrative of my helplessness. "Claire, you seem quiet tonight," Patricia observed, her voice dripping with false concern. "Are you feeling all right? You're not having any pain, are you?" "I'm fine," I replied evenly, "just thinking about the documents we discussed yesterday," Robert asked, cutting straight to the point. "Have you had a chance to review them with fresh eyes?" "I've reviewed them very carefully," I said. "In fact, I've been doing quite a bit of research about my situation." Angela perked up with interest. "Oh, what kind of research?" I smiled, the kind of smile that David used to call my poker face. "I've been learning about financial elder abuse, disability rights law, and something called predatory estate planning." Fascinating stuff. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus stopped mid-chew. Patricia's wine glass paused halfway to her lips, and Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That sounds awfully cynical, Claire," Patricia said carefully. "We're your family, we're trying to help you. Are you?" I asked, my voice pleasant and curious. "Because I've also been researching the legal requirements for having someone declared incompetent. Did you know that in Washington state, it requires testimony from multiple medical professionals who have conducted thorough examinations, and that the burden of proof is quite high?" Robert cleared his throat. "Claire, I think you're misunderstanding our intentions." "Am I? Then perhaps you can explain why Marcus has been researching disability law and estate planning for the past 8 months, instead of looking for a job. Or why Angela has been documenting my supposed cognitive decline in detailed emails. Or why you've been accessing my medical records without my consent." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them exchanging glances, trying to figure out how much I knew and how I had learned it. Finally, Patricia set down her wine glass and leaned forward. "Claire, if you've been reading our private communications, that's a serious violation of privacy." I laughed, a sound that surprised even me with its genuine amusement. privacy. You've been planning to strip me of my independence, steal my assets, and warehouse me in a nursing home, and you're concerned about privacy. We never said anything about stealing, Angela protested. We're talking about protection, about making sure you're cared for, I repeated, the same way I had the previous day. Let me ask you something. In all of your careful planning for my future, did any of you ever consider asking me what I wanted? Did it occur to any of you that I might have my own ideas about how to live with my disability? Claire, you're not thinking clearly, Robert said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he probably used with hospital staff. The accident was traumatic. You're not seeing the bigger picture. The bigger picture, I said, is that 4 people have been conspiring to defraud a disabled woman of her independence and assets under the guise of family concern. The bigger picture is that you've been treating my accident like a business opportunity. Marcus finally found his voice. Aunt Claire, that's not fair. We love you. We want what's best for you. If you loved me, I said, looking directly at him, you wouldn't have been researching how to have me declared incompetent before I was even out of the hospital. If you wanted what was best for me, you would have asked me what that looked like instead of deciding for yourselves. I pushed back from the table, my chair rolling smoothly across the hardwood floors that David and I had chosen together. I think it's time for all of you to leave. And Marcus, I'd like you to pack your things. Your stay here is over. Claire, you're being unreasonable, Patricia said, standing up. We can't just leave you alone like this. You're clearly upset. You're not thinking straight. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, I replied. And if any of you try to contact my doctors, my lawyer, or any other professional on my behalf without my explicit written consent, I will file charges for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Are we clear? They left in a flurry of protests and threats, but they left. Marcus packed his belongings with the efficiency of someone who had been prepared for this possibility, and within an hour my house was mine again. I sat in my living room as the sun set, surrounded by the silence I had been craving for months. But instead of feeling lonely or vulnerable, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my accident. I felt powerful. Tomorrow I would begin the process of protecting myself legally. I would update my will, establish ironclad protections against any future attempts to manipulate or control me, and create systems that would ensure my independence for the rest of my life. But tonight, I simply sat in the house that David and I had built together, the house where I had learned to live as a whole person in a wheelchair, and planned my next moves. My family thought my accident had made me helpless, had turned me into someone who needed to be managed and controlled. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next morning brought clarity like I hadn't felt in months. I woke early, transferred to my chair with the smooth efficiency I had developed over 8 months of practice, and began my day with the kind of purposeful energy that had once driven my architectural projects. Today wasn't about adaptation or recovery. Today was about construction, building the legal and financial fortress that would protect my independence for the rest of my life. James Morrison's law office occupied the top floor of a downtown Seattle building that I had actually consulted on 5 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me as I rode the elevator to the 23rd floor, remembering how I had advocated for better accessibility features during the building's design phase. Those modifications were serving me well now. James greeted me with the kind of concerned professionalism that reminded me why David and I had trusted him with our most important legal matters. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. More importantly, he had seen me at my strongest, when I was building a business and a life with David, which meant he wasn't going to mistake my current circumstances for incompetence. Claire, he said as his assistant brought us coffee, tell me everything. I had prepared for this conversation by printing out the email exchanges I had discovered on Marcus's laptop, along with copies of the documents Patricia had brought to my house. I spread them across James's conference table like evidence in a criminal case, which in many ways they were. James read through everything in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. This is one of the most blatant attempts at financial elder abuse I've seen in 30 years of practice, he said finally. And the fact that it's being perpetrated by your own family makes it even more despicable. What are my options? I asked. Legally, you have several avenues. We can file for restraining orders, pursue charges for conspiracy to commit fraud, and certainly, take action against Robert for his unauthorized access to your medical records. But Claire, I think the most important thing right now is to make sure this can never happen again. He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. We need to create a comprehensive estate plan that protects you from any future attempts at manipulation. That means updating your will with explicit language about your mental competency, establishing a trust structure that prevents anyone from challenging your decisions, and creating legal safeguards that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to have you declared incompetent. What about power of attorney? I asked. They seem to think that's their pathway to control. We'll draft very specific documents that designate exactly who can act on your behalf and under what circumstance. But more importantly, we'll include provisions that automatically revoke any power of attorney if it's ever used in a way that contradicts your explicitly stated wishes. Over the next 2 hours, James and I designed what he called a bulletproof legal framework. The new will would include detailed documentation of my mental state, my understanding of my assets, and my specific intentions for their distribution. It would explicitly state that my disability did not affect my cognitive function, and include testimony from my doctors confirming my mental competency. But the most powerful element was what James called the nuclear option. If anyone ever attempted to have me declared incompetent or challenged my mental capacity in court, the will would automatically trigger a complete redistribution of my assets to disability rights organizations, leaving my family with nothing. It's a scorched earth approach, James explained, but it removes any financial incentive for future challenges to your competency. If they can't benefit from having you declared incompetent, they won't try. I love it, I said, and I meant it, but I want to add something else. I want to establish a fund that helps other disabled people protect themselves from family predators. I want something good to come out of this. James smiled for the first time that morning. Now that sounds like the Claire I remember. The woman who never just solved problems but made them into opportunities to help others. We spent another hour designing what would become the Independent Living Legal Defense Fund, a trust that would provide legal assistance to disabled individuals facing financial exploitation by family members. It would be funded by a portion of my estate, but also by annual contributions that I could make during my lifetime. As we finished the paperwork, James asked the question I had been dreading. Claire, are you prepared for the fallout? When your family realizes what you've done, they're not going to react well. I know, I said. But James, they've already shown me who they are. They've already demonstrated that they see my disability as their opportunity. I can't unsee that, and I can't live my life walking on eggshells, trying to appease people who fundamentally don't respect my autonomy. What will you do about ongoing relationships? These are your siblings, your nephew. I had been thinking about this question since the previous evening. The relationships I thought I had with them were built on lies. They were playing roles, performing concern while planning my exploitation. I can't miss something that was never real. James nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. In my experience, people who are willing to exploit a family member's vulnerability once will do it again. You're not just protecting yourself now, you're protecting yourself for the rest of your life. That afternoon, I returned home to find Patricia's car in my driveway. She was sitting on my front porch with Angela, both of them wearing the kind of determined expressions that suggested they had spent the morning strategizing their next approach. Claire, Patricia called out as I maneuvered my chair up the ramp David had installed 2 years ago when his arthritis started making stairs difficult. We need to talk. Actually, we don't, I replied, using my key to unlock the front door. I've said everything I need to say. Please, Angela said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. We're family. We can work this out. I paused in my doorway and turned to look at them. Family doesn't conspiracy to steal from each other. Family doesn't document fake symptoms of mental decline. Family doesn't access medical records without permission. We were trying to help you, Patricia insisted. Maybe we went about it the wrong way, but our intentions were good. Your intentions, I said carefully, were to gain control of my assets by having me declared incompetent. Your intentions were to warehouse me in an expensive care facility that would drain my resources while you managed what was left. Those weren't good intentions, Patricia. Those were criminal intentions. Angela stood up, her face flushing red. You're being dramatic. We never said anything about having you declared incompetent. I pulled out my phone and opened the email app, where I had forwarded myself copies of their correspondence. Would you like me to read your email from 3 weeks ago where you discussed the medical route for gaining control of my affairs? Or perhaps the one where you researched the legal requirements for competency hearings? The color drained from Angela's face. Patricia looked like she was going to be sick. How did you get those? Patricia asked weakly. Does it matter? The point is that I know exactly what you've been planning, and I've taken steps to protect myself. My lawyer has filed documents that make it legally impossible for any of you to challenge my competency or gain control of my assets. If you try, you'll trigger an automatic distribution of my entire estate to charity. I rolled into my house and began to close the door, but Patricia jumped up and tried to block it. Claire, please, we can fix this, we can start over. No, I said firmly. We can't. You've shown me who you are when you think I'm vulnerable. You've shown me what our family relationships were really worth to you. There's no coming back from that. So that's it? Angela demanded. You're just going to cut us out of your life completely. You cut yourselves out, I replied. When you decided that my accident was your lottery ticket, you ended our relationships. I'm just making it official. I closed the door and locked it, then rolled to my living room window to watch them leave. They stood on my porch for several minutes, clearly arguing about their next move. Finally, they got in Patricia's car and drove away. But I knew this wasn't over. People who had spent 8 months planning to exploit me weren't going to give up after one confrontation. They would regroup, maybe try a different approach, possibly escalate their tactics. I was ready for them. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since my accident. I cooked, really cooked, not just the simple meals I had been preparing for myself, but an elaborate dinner with multiple courses. David had been the chef in our relationship, but I had learned enough from him to hold my own in the kitchen. The wheelchair actually made some tasks easier. I could roll from station to station with ingredients in my lap, and the lowered counters I had installed made prep work more comfortable. As I worked, I felt a sense of purpose and control that had been missing from my life for months. Every knife cut, every seasoning decision, every timing choice was mine to make. No one was hovering, offering unwanted help, or suggesting that I might be taking on too much. When I sat down to eat, I realized that this was the first meal I had enjoyed in my own home since before my accident. Not because the food was better than what my family had been bringing, but because it was mine. I had chosen it, prepared it, and was consuming it on my own terms. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Aunt Claire, I know you're angry, but please don't do anything permanent. We're family. We love you. Can we talk? I deleted the message without responding. Then I blocked his number, and Patricia's, and Angela's, and Robert. They had lost the right to access me when they decided to treat my disability as their opportunity. Instead, I called my friend Sarah, who had been my closest colleague during my architectural career. We had maintained a friendship since my accident, but I had been so consumed with family drama that I hadn't been fully present in any of my relationships outside that toxic circle. Claire, Sarah said warmly when she answered. How are you feeling? I've been thinking about you. I'm feeling, I said slowly, like myself again, for the first time in months. We talked for over an hour. I told her about the legal protections I had put in place, about the fund I was establishing, about my plans to maybe return to some form of architectural consulting that I could do from home. She told me about projects she was working on, industry changes I had missed, opportunities that might interest me. When we hung up, I realized that this was what real support looked like. Sarah didn't try to manage me or make decisions for me. She didn't treat my disability as a limitation that required her intervention. She treated me like the competent professional and friend I had always been. Someone whose circumstances had changed but whose essential self remained intact. The contrast with my family's behavior couldn't have been starker. Over the next few days, I began the process of reclaiming my life in earnest. I updated all my financial accounts with new passwords and security questions. I contacted my doctor's offices to ensure that my medical information couldn't be accessed by anyone without my explicit written consent. I changed my home security codes and had new locks installed. But most importantly, I began reaching out to the wider disability community in ways I hadn't before my accident. I contacted the local independent living center, volunteered with a nonprofit that helped newly disabled individuals navigate their rights, and started researching the legal landscape around disability rights more comprehensively. What I discovered shocked me. Financial exploitation of disabled individuals by family members was far more common than I had realized. The statistics were staggering. People with disabilities were 3 times more likely to be victims of financial abuse than the general population, and family members were the perpetrators in over 60% of cases. I wasn't an isolated victim of particularly greedy relatives. I was part of a widespread pattern of exploitation that targeted some of the most vulnerable members of society. That realization crystallized my resolve. The Independent Living Legal Defense Fund wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about addressing a systemic problem that destroyed lives and perpetuated the myth that disabled people couldn't be trusted to manage their own affairs. 2 weeks after I had kicked my family out of my house, I received a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. The return address showed it was from a legal practice that specialized in elder law and disability rights. For a moment, my heart sank. Had my family found lawyers willing to help them challenge my competency? But when I opened the letter, I discovered something entirely different. It was from an attorney named David Chen, who had heard about my situation through professional network. He specialized in representing disabled individuals against family financial predators, and he was offering his services to help me pursue criminal charges against my relatives. Cases like yours, he wrote, are rarely prosecuted because victims are often isolated and lack resources to fight back. But you're in a unique position to send a message that this kind of exploitation has real consequences. I called him immediately. Mr. Chen, I said when he answered, I'm interested in your offer, but I need to know, what would prosecution actually accomplish? Legally, it would establish precedent for treating this kind of family exploitation as the serious crime it is, he explained. Practically, it would make it much harder for them to target other vulnerable family members in the future. And personally, it would give you the satisfaction of seeing justice done. What about the evidence? Is what I have sufficient? The emails alone constitute conspiracy to commit fraud. Robert's unauthorized access to your medical records is a federal crime under HIPAA, and Patricia's attempt to get you to sign over power of attorney under false pretenses is textbook elder abuse, even though you're not technically elderly. We talked for another 30 minutes about the process, the timeline, and the likely outcome. At the end of the conversation, I made a decision that felt like the final piece of my personal reconstruction. Mr. Chen, I said, let's pursue charges. All of them. The next phase of my life began with a phone call from Detective Maria Santos of the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. She had been assigned to investigate the conspiracy charges that Mr. Chen had filed on my behalf, and she needed to interview me about the details of my family's scheme. Detective Santos arrived at my house on a gray Thursday morning, carrying a digital recorder and a thick folder of documents. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. Miss Fletcher, she said as I led her into my living room, I've reviewed the initial evidence your attorney provided. I have to say, in 15 years of investigating financial crimes, I've rarely seen documentation this comprehensive of a conspiracy in progress. She set up her recorder on my coffee table and opened her folder. The emails you obtained from your nephew's computer show clear intent to defraud. The medical records accessed by your brother-in-law violates federal privacy law, and the power of attorney documents your sister presented contain language that would constitute elder abuse under Washington state law. Even though I'm not elderly, I asked, The law has been expanded to cover financial exploitation of disabled adults of any age. She explained. Your family's attempt to use your disability as justification for seizing control of your assets fits the legal definition perfectly. We spent the next 2 hours going through every detail of my family's scheme. Detective Santos asked probing questions about the timeline, the specific roles each family member had played, and the methods they had used to try to manipulate me. She was particularly interested in Robert's access to my medical records, and the documented pattern of Angela's false reports about my mental state. The medical records violation is federal, she explained. That means the FBI will likely take over that aspect of the investigation. The conspiracy and fraud charges will be handled by the county prosecutor's office. But Miss Fletcher, I need you to understand what you're signing up for here. She leaned forward, her expression serious. Prosecuting family members is always complicated. Your relatives will likely claim that everything they did was motivated by genuine concern for your welfare. They'll portray themselves as loving family members trying to protect a vulnerable disabled woman. They'll make you out to be paranoid, vindictive, maybe even mentally unstable. Let them try, I said firmly. I have documentation of their real motives. I have their own words proving this was about money, not care. That's true, and it's powerful evidence, but criminal trials can be brutal, especially when family relationships are involved. Are you prepared for the public scrutiny, for having your personal life dissected in court, for the possibility that some people will believe their version of events instead of yours? I had been thinking about these questions since my conversation with Mr. Chen. Detective Santos, before my accident, I was a successful professional who managed complex projects and made decisions that affected millions of dollars in construction budgets. After my accident, my own family decided I was incompetent to manage my own life. If I don't fight this, if I don't hold them accountable, what message does that send to other disabled people who are being exploited by their families? She nodded slowly. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Too many victims in cases like this choose not to prosecute because they're afraid of the family drama or the public attention, but cases like yours can set important precedents. Detective Santos explained the next steps in the investigation. She would be interviewing Marcus, Patricia, Robert, and Angela separately, confronting them with the evidence of their conspiracy. She would also be working with federal agents to investigate Robert's unauthorized access to my medical records, and with the county prosecutor to determine which charges to file. There's one more thing, she said as she prepared to leave. Has anyone in your family attempted to contact you since you discovered their scheme? They've tried calling and texting, but I've blocked their numbers. Patricia and Angela showed up at my house a few days ago, but I refused to engage with them. Good. Any contact you have with them could potentially be used to support their claims that this is all a family misunderstanding rather than a criminal conspiracy. If they show up here again, call me immediately. After Detective Santos left, I sat in my living room feeling a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. I had set powerful forces in motion, forces that would fundamentally change my relationship with my family forever. There would be no going back from this point. No possibility of reconciliation or family dinners, where everyone pretended the conspiracy had never happened. But as I thought about the alternative, living in fear that they might try again, always wondering if they were plotting new ways to undermine my independence, I knew I had made the right choice. Some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive, some violations of trust too complete to repair. That afternoon, I received a call from James Morrison with an update on the legal protections we had put in place. Claire, I've finished filing all the documents we discussed. Your new will is ironclad, the trust structure is in place, and I've added some additional safeguards based on what you've told me about the criminal investigation. What kind of safeguard? If any member of your family is convicted of crimes related to their attempt to exploit you, they're automatically barred from any inheritance under your will, regardless of any future changes you might make to the document. It prevents them from arguing that you later forgave them and intended to restore their inheritance. That's perfect, I said. What about the legal defense fund? That's established and operational. I've already received inquiries from 3 attorneys who specialize in disability rights law, asking about funding for cases similar to yours. The word is getting out that there's finally a resource available for people in these situations. James paused before continuing. Claire, I have to ask, how are you holding up emotionally? This kind of family betrayal can be devastating, even when you're taking all the right steps to protect yourself. It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself. Honestly, James, I think I'm doing better than I expected. Maybe it's because the betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that there's no ambiguity to torment myself with. They showed me exactly who they are, and now I can respond accordingly. That's a healthy perspective, but don't hesitate to reach out if you need support. Prosecuting family members is emotionally taxing, even when you're absolutely in the right. That evening I decided to do something I hadn't done since before my accident. I started sketching architectural design, not for any specific project, just for the pleasure of creating something beautiful and functional. I had a drafting table that David had given me for our anniversary 5 years ago, and I had adjusted its height to work well with my wheelchair. As I worked, drawing lines and shapes that gradually became a modern house design, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent from my life for months. This was who I was, not a victim to be managed or a problem to be solved, but a creative professional with valuable skills and insight. My phone rang, interrupting my work. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Claire Fletcher? The voice was unfamiliar, elderly, with a slight tremor. Yes. Who is this? My name is Eleanor Wall. I got your number from the Independent Living Legal Defense Fund. Ms. Fletcher? I need help, and I was told you might understand my situation. I set down my pencil and gave the call my full attention. What's happening, Ellen? My son and daughter-in-law have been pressuring me to sign over my house and my savings account to them. They say it's for my own protection, that I'm getting too old to manage my finances safely. But Ms. Fletcher? I'm only 73. I'm in good health, and I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The familiar pattern made my stomach clench. Have they brought you legal documents to sign? Yes. Power of attorney paper. They've also been telling people in my neighborhood that I'm becoming forgetful, that I've been making poor decisions with money. None of it's true, but they're creating a narrative that makes their takeover seem reasonable. Eleanor, have you spoken to a lawyer? I can't afford one. I'm on a fixed income, and the lawyers I've called want retainers. I simply don't have. That's when someone at the senior center told me about your fund. I felt a surge of purpose unlike anything I had experienced since my accident. This was exactly why I had created the fund, to help people like Eleanor who were facing the same predatory behavior I had encountered, but without the financial resources to fight back. Eleanor, I'm going to connect you with an attorney who specializes in these cases. The fund will cover all legal costs, but I need you to do something for me. I need you to document everything, every conversation, every document they've shown you, every instance where they've told people you're incompetent. Can you do that? Oh yes, she said, her voice gaining strength. I've been keeping a journal of everything they've said and done. I may be 73, but I'm not stupid. You're absolutely not stupid, Eleanor. You're a victim of financial predators who are using ageism to justify their greed, but we're going to stop them. After I hung up with Eleanor, I realized that this phone call had given me something I hadn't expected, a sense of mission that went beyond my own situation. My family's betrayal had led me to create something that could help other people protect themselves from similar exploitation. The next morning brought news that accelerated everything. Detective Santos called to inform me that she had interviewed Marcus the previous day, and his response to her questions had been illuminating. He tried to play the concerned nephew role at first, she explained, claimed everything they did was motivated by love and worry about your well-being, but when I showed him the emails we had obtained, his story fell apart completely. What did he say? He admitted that the family had discussed your financial situation extensively since your accident. He confirmed that Robert had accessed your medical records without authorization, and he acknowledged that they had researched legal methods for gaining control of your assets. Did he explain why they thought they had the right to do that? Detective Santos's voice took on a disgusted tone. According to Marcus, your family felt that your disability made you vulnerable to exploitation by outsiders, so they needed to protect you by taking control themselves. He seemed genuinely surprised when I pointed out that they were the ones exploiting you. The irony is stunning. I said, they convinced themselves they were protecting me from exploitation while planning to exploit me themselves. It gets worse. Marcus also revealed that they had discussed what to do if you became suspicious of their plan. Patricia apparently suggested that they might need to have you evaluated by a psychiatrist who could support a claim of mental instability. The casual cruelty of that revelation took my breath away. They hadn't just planned to steal my assets. They had been prepared to destroy my reputation and credibility to do it. Detective Santos, what happens next? The prosecutor's office is reviewing the case for formal charges. Based on the evidence we've gathered, I expect them to file conspiracy to commit fraud charges against all 4 family members, plus additional charges for Robert's medical records violations. How long will that take? Probably another week or 2. But Claire, there's something else you should know. Patricia has hired a lawyer, and he's already started making noise about your mental state. He's claiming that your decision to pursue criminal charges proves you're not thinking rationally. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course he is. When predators get caught, they always try to discredit their victims. Exactly, but their strategy might backfire. The more they insist you're mentally incompetent, the more obvious it becomes that their entire scheme was based on that false premise. That afternoon, I had a visitor I wasn't expecting. Sarah knocked on my door, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested she had something important to say. Claire, she said as I let her in, I've been hearing rumors about your family's situation. Are you okay? I led her to the living room and told her everything. The conspiracy, the emails, the criminal investigation, the legal protections I had put in place. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing more appalled with each detail. Jesus Christ, Claire, she said when I finished. I knew your family had been hovering since your accident, but I had no idea they were planning something like this. Did you notice anything when you saw them? Any signs that they were treating me differently? Sarah thought for a moment. Actually, yes. The last time I was here for dinner, when your sister was visiting, I remember thinking that they were talking about you like you weren't in the room, making decisions about what you should eat, what activities you should avoid, that sort of thing. It felt paternalistic, but I thought maybe it was just overprotectiveness after your accident. It was never about protection, I said. It was always about control. What can I do to help? Sarah asked. Do you need anything? Support during the trial? Someone to advocate for you professionally? The offer touched me deeply. Actually, there is something. I've been thinking about returning to work in some capacity, maybe consulting on accessibility design for residential projects. Would you be willing to be a reference for my competency and professional skills? Absolutely. Claire, you're one of the most brilliant designers I've ever worked with. Your accident didn't change that. We spent the rest of the evening talking about potential projects, industry contacts, and ways I could re-engage with my professional community. By the time Sarah left, I felt more optimistic about my future than I had in months. The following week brought the news I had been waiting for. Detective Santos called to inform me that the county prosecutor had filed formal charges against all 4 of my family members. Patricia, Robert, and Angela are each being charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She explained. Marcus is being charged as an accessory to fraud. Robert is also facing federal charges for the medical records violations. What happens now? They'll be arrested and arraigned. Bail will probably be set, though it might be high given the nature of the charge. Then we move toward trial, unless they decide to plead guilty. Do you think they'll plead guilty? Honestly, I doubt it. People who commit these kinds of crimes usually convince themselves they were justified. They'll probably claim they were trying to help you and that you're pursuing charges because you're mentally unstable. Let them try. I have 8 months of documented competent decision-making since my accident, plus the testimony of my doctors, my lawyer and my professional colleague. That's exactly right, Claire. I want you to know that this case is already having an impact. Other victims are coming forward, inspired by your willingness to fight back. You're not just protecting yourself, you're helping to change how these crimes are perceived and prosecuted. That afternoon, I received a call from Mr. Chen with additional news. Claire, I've been contacted by 3 other attorneys who are representing disabled individuals in similar cases. They want to coordinate our legal strategies and share resources. Your case is becoming a catalyst for broader action against family financial predators. That's wonderful, I said. What kind of coordination are they proposing? Sharing expert witnesses, coordinating media strategies and developing legal precedents that can be used in future cases. But most importantly, they want to establish a network of attorneys who specialize in these cases, funded partly by your legal defense fund. Do it. Whatever resources they need, whatever coordination will be most effective. There's one more thing. The local disability rights organization wants to feature your story in their newsletter and on their website. They think it could help other victims recognize the warning signs of family financial abuse. I agreed immediately. If sharing my story could help even one person protect themselves from family predators, it would be worth any invasion of privacy. 2 days later, I woke to find news vans parked outside my house. Somehow, word of the arrests had leaked to the media, and my case had become a local news story. I watched from my window as reporters set up cameras on my lawn, clearly hoping to get a statement from me. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Mr. Chen. Claire, I assume you've seen the media circus outside your house. How do you want to handle this? I want to talk to them, I said without hesitation. I want to tell my story, on my terms, before my family's lawyers start spinning their version of events. Are you sure? Once you go public, there's no taking it back. I'm sure, but I want you there with me. An hour later, I rolled out onto my front porch with Mr. Chen beside me. The reporters surged forward with cameras and microphones, shouting questions over each other. I raised my hand for silence, and gradually, they quieted down. My name is Claire Fletcher, I began, my voice carrying clearly in the morning air. 8 months ago, I was injured in a car accident that left me paralyzed from the waist down. For the past 8 months, my family has been planning to exploit my disability for financial gain. I spoke for 20 minutes, outlining the basic facts of the case without revealing details that might compromise the prosecution. I explained how my family had used my accident as an opportunity to seize control of my assets, how they had documented false evidence of mental decline, and how they had planned to have me declared incompetent. I want to be clear about something, I said in closing. My disability does not make me helpless. My paralysis does not affect my cognitive function or my ability to make decisions about my own life. The only thing that makes disabled people vulnerable to this kind of exploitation is the assumption that we can't protect ourselves. What would you say to other disabled people who might be facing similar situations? One reporter asked. Document everything, trust your instincts, get legal help, and remember that you have the right to control your own life, regardless of what your family thinks is best for you. The story ran on the evening news and was picked up by several national outlets. My phone rang constantly for the next 2 days, with calls from other victims, from disability rights advocates, and from attorneys who wanted to discuss similar cases. But the call that meant the most came from Eleanor Walsh. Miss Fletcher, she said, her voice stronger than it had been during our first conversation. I saw your interview on the news. I wanted to thank you for giving me the courage to fight back. How are things going with your case, Eleanor? The attorney you connected me with has filed for a restraining order against my son and daughter-in-law. They're not allowed to contact me or enter my property without court permission. And we're pursuing criminal charges for their attempted fraud. I'm so proud of you, Eleanor. How are you feeling? Free, she said simply. For the first time in months, I feel free. After I hung up, I realized that Eleanor had perfectly captured what I was feeling too. Despite the ongoing legal proceedings, despite the media attention, despite the complete destruction of my family relationships, I felt free in a way I hadn't since my accident. For 8 months, I had been struggling to adapt to my physical limitations while surrounded by people who saw those limitations as opportunities to control me. I had been fighting to maintain my independence while being constantly undermined by the very people who claimed to love me. Now finally I was fighting back on my own terms. I was using my resources and my intelligence to protect not just myself but other people facing similar exploitation. I was turning my family's betrayal into something powerful and positive. The trial was still months away, and I knew it would be difficult. My family's lawyers would try to portray me as a vindictive disabled woman who had turned against her loving family. They would question my mental state, my decision-making capacity, and my motives for pursuing charges. But I was ready for them. I had documentation, witnesses, legal protection, and most importantly, I had the truth. My family had revealed themselves to be predators who saw my disability as their opportunity. Now they would face the consequences of that choice. As I sat in my living room that evening, looking at the architectural sketches I had been working on, I realized that I was building more than just houses in my drawings. I was building a new life, one based on my own choices and my own values, rather than other people's expectations or limitations. My accident had taken my ability to walk, but my family's betrayal had given me something unexpected: absolute clarity about who I was and what I wanted my life to become. I was no longer the woman who had tried to maintain peace by accommodating other people's demands. I was no longer the family member who kept quiet to avoid conflict. I was Claire Fletcher, architect, advocate, and survivor. I was a woman who had faced the worst kind of betrayal and turned it into a force for protecting others. I was someone who refused to be diminished by either disability or family dysfunction. And I was just getting started. The next phase of my transformation began with a phone call from Rebecca Martinez, a documentary filmmaker who specialized in disability rights stories. She had seen my news interview and wanted to explore the possibility of making a film about family financial abuse of disabled individuals. "Claire," she said during our initial conversation, "your case is just the tip of the iceberg. There are thousands of disabled people being exploited by their families every year, but most cases never make it to court because the victims don't have the resources to fight back." "What kind of documentary are you envisioning?" "I want to tell the stories of multiple victims, showing the patterns of exploitation and the systemic failures that enable this kind of abuse. But I also want to showcase the solutions, the legal protections you've put in place, the fund you've created, the network of attorneys who are starting to specialize in these cases." The idea excited me. "How can I help?" "I'd like you to be one of the central figures in the film. Your case is unique because you had the resources and the intelligence to fight back effectively, but I also want to include people like Eleanor Walsh, victims who couldn't have protected themselves without the systems you've established." Over the next several weeks, Rebecca and I worked together to develop the documentary concept. We identified other victims who were willing to share their stories, attorneys who could speak to the legal issues, and disability rights advocates who could provide broader context about the scope of the problem. But the most powerful element of the documentary would be following several ongoing cases, showing in real time how the legal protections and resources I had created were helping other victims fight back against family predators. During this same period, the criminal case against my family was moving forward. Detective Santos kept me informed about the prosecution's strategy and the defense arguments that were beginning to emerge. As expected, she told me during one of our regular updates, their lawyers are claiming that everything they did was motivated by genuine concern for your welfare. They're portraying themselves as a loving family trying to protect a vulnerable disabled woman who has now turned against them out of paranoia and spite. What evidence are they presenting to support that narrative? Mostly character witnesses who will testify about their previous relationships with you. and expert testimony about the psychological effects of traumatic accidents. They're trying to argue that your accident caused personality changes that make you suspicious and vindictive. That's ridiculous. I have months of documented interactions with medical professionals, attorneys, friends, and colleagues that prove my mental state is stable. Exactly. And that's what makes their defense strategy so weak. They're essentially arguing that you became mentally unstable enough to falsely accuse your entire family of conspiracy, but competent enough to manage complex legal proceedings and establish sophisticated financial protection. The contradiction was glaring, but I knew that trials didn't always follow logical patterns. Juries could be swayed by emotional appeals, and the image of a grieving family being prosecuted by an angry disabled relative might resonate with some people. That's why I was grateful when Ms. Chen told me about the prosecution's strategy for presenting my case. "We're not going to ask the jury to take your word against your family's word," he explained. "We're going to let your family's own words convict them. The emails, the documented lies, the research into how to have you declared incompetent, it's all going to be presented in their own voices. What about their claims that I'm mentally unstable? We have a team of expert witnesses who will testify about your cognitive function, your decision-making capacity, and your professional competence. But more importantly, we have the evidence of your actions since discovering their conspiracy, the legal protections you've established, the fund you've created, the other victims you've helped. Those aren't the actions of someone who's mentally unstable." As we prepared for trial, I also continued developing my new professional identity. With Sarah's help, I had begun consulting on accessibility design for several residential projects. The work was fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected, allowing me to use my personal experience with disability to create truly functional living spaces for other people with mobility limitations. One project in particular gave me enormous satisfaction. I was working with a young man named David, the name wasn't lost on me, who had been injured in a rock climbing accident. Like me, he was learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair. But unlike me, he was starting this process at age 25, with his entire adult life ahead of him. "Ms. Letcher," he said during our first consultation, "I don't want a house that looks like a medical facility. I want something that's beautiful and modern but also completely functional for someone like me." "That's exactly what we're going to create," I assured him. Accessibility doesn't have to mean institutional. It can mean elegantly designed for the way you actually live. Working with David reminded me that my accident, devastating as it had been, had also given me unique insights and capability. I understood the daily realities of wheelchair navigation in ways that able-bodied architects couldn't. I knew which design compromises were actually necessary, and which were just assumptions based on stereotypes about disability. This work was becoming more than just a way to re-engage professionally. It was becoming a form of advocacy, a way to challenge assumptions about what disabled people needed and wanted in their living spaces. The trial date was set for early spring, about 6 months after the arrest. As we moved closer to that date, I found myself feeling increasingly confident about the outcome. The evidence against my family was overwhelming, and my own credibility was supported by months of competent decision-making and professional activity. But I also knew that regardless of the trial's outcome, I had already won the most important victory. I had protected my independence, helped other victims protect theirs, and created systems that would continue helping people long after my own case was resolved. My family had tried to use my disability to justify taking control of my life. Instead, they had catalyzed a transformation that made me more powerful and more purposeful than I had ever been before my accident. The irony was perfect. In trying to make me helpless, they had helped me discover just how capable I really was. The trial began on a crisp Monday morning in March, nearly a year after my accident had changed everything. I arrived at the courthouse with Miss Chen and Detective Santos, navigating through a small crowd of reporters and disability rights advocates who had come to observe what many were calling a landmark case in family financial abuse prosecution. As I rolled into the courtroom, I caught sight of my family for the first time since I had kicked them out of my house months earlier. Patricia sat at the defense table looking older and more haggard than I remembered, her usually perfect appearance diminished by stress and legal bills. Robert hunched in his chair, avoiding eye contact, while Angela kept glancing nervously around the courtroom as if looking for escape routes. Marcus sat apart from the others, his young face drawn with what might have been remorse or simply fear of the consequences he was finally facing. Their attorney, a silver-haired man named William Hartley who specialized in defending white-collar criminals, had clearly coached them on courtroom behavior. They maintained expressions of wounded dignity, the look of loving family members who couldn't understand how their disabled relative had turned against them so viciously. Judge Margaret Thornton called the court to order with the efficient manner of someone who had presided over countless family disputes, but rarely ones involving criminal charges of this magnitude. She was a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing as she surveyed the packed courtroom. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant District Attorney Karen Walsh, a woman whose reputation for prosecuting financial crimes had made her the natural choice for this case. She stood before the jury with quiet authority and began to outline the systematic conspiracy that my family had orchestrated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is about predators who saw vulnerability and decided to exploit it for financial gain. The defendant's sister, Patricia Morrison, the defendant's brother-in-law, Robert Morrison, the defendant's sister, Angela Price, and the defendant's nephew, Marcus Morrison, conspired to steal the independence and assets of a disabled woman under the guise of family concern." She walked them through the timeline methodically, from the early planning stages while I was still in the hospital to the final confrontation when Patricia had arrived with fraudulent legal documents. She explained how they had researched disability law not to protect me but to find ways around my legal rights. She detailed Robert's illegal access to my medical records and Angela's documentation of fabricated mental decline symptoms. "The evidence will show," Walsh concluded, "that these defendants never once asked Claire Fletcher what she wanted or needed. They never consulted her about her own care or her own future. Instead, they plotted in secret to seize control of her life and her assets, treating her disability as their opportunity for financial gain." Defense attorney Hartley's opening statement painted a drastically different picture. He portrayed my family as loving relatives overwhelmed by concern for a woman whose traumatic accident had left her unable to make rational decisions about her own welfare. "My clients are not criminals," he told the jury earnestly. "They are a family watching their beloved sister and aunt struggle with the devastating psychological effects of a life-changing accident." When Claire Fletcher began making increasingly isolated and suspicious decisions, when she started pushing away the people who loved her most, they tried to intervene not for financial gain, but out of genuine fear for her safety and well-being. He acknowledged that they had made mistakes in their approach, that perhaps they should have been more direct in their communications with me, but he insisted that every action they had taken was motivated by love and concern, not greed or malice. "The prosecution wants you to believe that a grief-stricken family's attempts to help their disabled relative constitute criminal conspiracy," Hartley continued. "But the evidence will show that Claire Fletcher's accusations are the product of a mind damaged by trauma, a woman who has turned against her own family because she can no longer distinguish between help and harm." The first week of testimony focused on establishing the timeline and the evidence of conspiracy. Detective Santos walked the jury through the email chains that Marcus had carelessly left on his laptop, reading aloud the callous discussions of my financial assets and their plans for gaining control. The impact on the jury was visible as they heard my family's own words describing their scheme. When Robert's unauthorized access to my medical records was presented, several jurors looked genuinely shocked. The prosecution had brought in an expert on HIPAA violations who explained exactly how serious Robert's breach of medical privacy was, and how it demonstrated the premeditated nature of their conspiracy. But it was Angela's fabricated documentation of my supposed mental decline that seemed to disturb the jury most. The prosecution presented her detailed emails describing incidents that had never happened, conversations that were completely fictional, and behavioral changes that existed only in her imagination. The defendant Angela Price documented over 30 supposed incidents of confusion, memory loss, and poor judgment, Prosecutor Walsh explained to the jury, but when we investigated each of these claims, we found that they were completely false. On dates when she claimed Claire Fletcher was exhibiting signs of dementia, Ms. Fletcher was actually conducting business meetings, managing complex financial transactions, and making sophisticated legal decisions. The defense's strategy became clear during their cross-examination. They focused relentlessly on my emotional state following the accident, suggesting that trauma and grief had made me paranoid and vindictive. They brought in a psychiatrist who had never examined me but was willing to testify about the potential psychological effects of sudden disability. Traumatic paralysis often results in what we call personality fragmentation. Dr. Harrison testified for the defense. Patients may become suspicious of the people closest to them, interpreting loving concern as malicious intent. This is particularly common when the patient was previously very independent and is struggling to accept help from others, but the prosecution's response was devastating. They had assembled a team of medical professionals who had actually treated me, along with colleagues who had worked with me professionally since my accident. Each one testified about my cognitive function, my decision-making capacity, and my emotional stability. My neurologist, Dr. Rebecca Kim, was particularly effective. Ms. Fletcher's paralysis resulted from spinal cord injury with no brain involvement whatsoever. She testified, her cognitive function was never affected by her accident. She has demonstrated consistent mental acuity, appropriate emotional responses, and sophisticated reasoning abilities throughout her recovery. When my former colleague Sarah took the stand, her testimony about my professional competence was powerful. She described the accessibility consulting work I had been doing, the complex problem-solving it required, and the positive feedback I had received from clients. Claire Fletcher is one of the most brilliant architects I've ever worked with, Sarah testified. Her accident didn't change her intelligence or her professional judgment. If anything, her personal experience with disability has made her insights more valuable, not less. The prosecution also called Eleanor Walsh, the elderly woman whose case had been one of the first handled by my legal defense fund. Her testimony about how the fund had helped her protect herself from family financial predators demonstrated that my response to discovering my family's conspiracy had been rational and constructive, not the vindictive reaction of an unstable mind. Ms. Fletcher saved my independence and probably my life, Eleanor testified. When my own family was trying to steal my assets, she provided the legal help I needed to fight back. That's not the action of someone who's mentally unstable. That's the action of someone who understands exactly what family financial abuse looks like and wants to prevent it from happening to others. But the most powerful moment of the trial came when I took the stand myself. I had been dreading this moment, knowing that Hartley would try to paint me as an unreliable narrator of my own experience, but I was also eager for the opportunity to tell my story in my own words, without interpretation or spin from either side. Prosecutor Walsh led me through my testimony carefully, establishing my professional background, my financial situation, and the timeline of my family's conspiracy. I spoke calmly and clearly about discovering their scheme, about the emotional impact of realizing that people I had trusted were planning to exploit my disability, and about the steps I had taken to protect myself and help others. Ms. Fletcher, Walsh asked, when you discovered what your family was planning, what was your primary emotion? Clarity, I answered without hesitation. For months I had been feeling like something was wrong, like I was being treated differently than before my accident, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. When I saw their emails and understood their plan, everything suddenly made sense. Did you ever consider simply confronting them and asking them to stop? No, I said firmly. Their correspondence made it clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a well-intentioned mistake. They had spent months researching how to exploit my disability legally. They had documented false evidence of mental decline. They had discussed having me declared incompetent if I wouldn't cooperate. These weren't people who would listen to reason. They were people who saw my accident as their financial opportunity. When Hartley began his cross-examination, he immediately attacked my decision to pursue criminal charges rather than handling the matter within the family. Ms. Fletcher, isn't it true that before your accident, you would have tried to resolve a family dispute through communication rather than criminal prosecution? Before my accident, I replied, my family had never conspired to steal my assets and have me declared mentally incompetent. there's no family conversation that can resolve fraud and conspiracy. But surely you understand that your family was motivated by concern for your welfare, not malicious intent, Mr. Hartley. I've read their email. They discussed my life expectancy, my asset values, and the most efficient ways to gain control of my finances. They researched legal strategies for having me declared incompetent. They documented false evidence of mental decline. At no point in any of their correspondence did they express genuine concern for my welfare or happiness. Their only concern was gaining control of my money. Hartley tried to shake my composure by questioning my decision-making capacity, suggesting that my aggressive legal response proved I wasn't thinking clearly. Miss Fletcher, don't you think that a mentally healthy person might have tried family counseling or mediation before pursuing criminal charges? Mr. Hartley, I replied, a mentally healthy person recognizes criminal behavior when she sees it and responds appropriately. My family wasn't interested in counseling or mediation. They were interested in stealing my independence and my assets. I responded by protecting myself and helping other victims do the same. But isn't your establishment of this legal defense fund just another way of attacking your family, using your resources to wage war against people who were trying to help you? This question gave me the opportunity I had been waiting for. The Legal Defense Fund has helped 12 disabled individuals protect themselves from family financial abuse in the past 8 months. It has funded legal representation for people who couldn't afford to defend themselves against family predators. It has created a network of attorneys who specialize in these cases, and has established legal precedents that protect disabled people's rights to self-determination. I paused, looking directly at the jury. If my family's attempt to exploit my disability resulted in resources that help other victims protect themselves, then something good came out of their betrayal. But that doesn't make their actions any less criminal. The trial's final phase focused on the specific charges against each defendant. The evidence against Robert for his unauthorized access to my medical records was ironclad. The prosecution had digital forensics proving exactly when and how he had accessed confidential information about my medical condition and shared it with the other conspirators. Patricia's role in presenting fraudulent legal documents was equally clear. The prosecution demonstrated that she had worked with an attorney to draft power of attorney papers that contained deliberately misleading language designed to give her far broader control than she had represented to me. Angela's documentation of fabricated symptoms was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. Email after email showed her creating fictional narratives about my mental state, building a case for my incompetence that had no basis in reality. Marcus's role as the coordinator and researcher for the conspiracy was proven through his own browser history and email correspondence. Despite his youth, he had been a knowing and willing participant in planning my exploitation. After 3 weeks of testimony, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, walking the jury through each element of the conspiracy and demonstrating how my family had systematically planned to exploit my disability for financial gain. Defense attorney Hartley made one final attempt to portray his clients as a loving family destroyed by false accusations from a traumatized, disabled woman, but the weight of evidence against them was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Patricia, Robert and Angela were convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Marcus was convicted as an accessory to fraud. Robert's federal charges for medical privacy violations would be handled in a separate proceeding. As the verdicts were read, I felt a profound sense of vindication, not just personal vindication, although that was certainly part of it, but vindication for every disabled person who had ever been told they couldn't make their own decisions, every victim of family financial abuse who had been dismissed as paranoid or ungrateful. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Patricia and Robert each received 18 months in prison plus substantial fines and restitution. Angela received 12 months, while Marcus got probation and community service due to his age and cooperation with the investigation. But the real victory wasn't the criminal sentences,
It was the precedent the case had established and the systems it had created to protect other victims. In the year following the trial, the Independent Living Legal Defense Fund helped over 50 disabled individuals protect themselves from family financial predators. The network of specialized attorneys had grown to include practitioners in 12 states. The legal precedents established by my case were being cited in courtrooms across the country. The documentary that Rebecca Martinez had created premiered at several film festivals and was eventually picked up by a streaming service, reaching millions of viewers and raising awareness about family financial abuse of disabled individuals. The film's impact led to legislative changes in several states, strengthening legal protections for disabled adults and creating new penalties for family financial exploitation. My own life had transformed completely. The accessibility consulting business I had developed was thriving, giving me both professional fulfillment and financial independence. I had designed homes for dozens of disabled individuals, creating living spaces that were both beautiful and completely functional for people with various mobility limitations. More importantly, I had discovered a sense of purpose that I never could have imagined before my accident. My family's betrayal had led me to understand how widespread family financial abuse really was, and my response had created resources that were helping victims across the country protect themselves. The house that David and I had designed remained my sanctuary, but it had also become something more. I regularly hosted support groups for family financial abuse survivors, bringing together people who had faced similar betrayals and were rebuilding their lives on their own terms. One evening, about 18 months after the trial, I was working on architectural plans for a new accessible housing development when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Eleanor Walsh's number. "Claire," she said, her voice bright with excitement, "I wanted to call and tell you the news. My granddaughter just graduated from law school, and she's planning to specialize in disability rights law. She says she was inspired by your case and wants to help other people the way you helped me." "That's wonderful, Eleanor. How are you doing?" "I'm doing beautiful. I'm still in my own home, still managing my own affairs, still making my own decisions, and I'm volunteering with the local Disability Rights Center, helping other seniors recognize the warning signs of family financial abuse." After we hung up, I realized that Eleanor's story captured something essential about what my family's betrayal had ultimately accomplished. They had tried to make me helpless, to reduce me to a victim who needed their management and control. Instead, they had catalyzed a transformation that made me more powerful than I had ever been. Their conspiracy hadn't just failed, it had backfired spectacularly, creating systems and resources that were protecting hundreds of other people from similar exploitation. As I returned to my architectural drawings, designing spaces where disabled people could live with dignity and independence, I thought about the strange trajectory that had brought me to this point. My accident had taken my ability to walk, but my family's betrayal had given me something I never expected: absolute clarity about my own strength and purpose. I was no longer the woman who had tried to maintain peace by accommodating other people's expectations. I was no longer someone who worried about family approval or social acceptance. I was Claire Fletcher, architect, advocate, and survivor. I was a woman who had faced the worst kind of betrayal and transformed it into a force for protecting others. My family had called me helpless after my accident. Instead, I had helped myself to a new will, a new life, and a new understanding of what was possible when you refused to let other people define your limitations. The irony was perfect, and the victory was complete. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.